Probably one of the most difficult aspects of outdoor and landscape photography is trying to determine the best way to properly expose a scene under difficult lighting situations, which is pretty common when it comes to landscape photography. It's often that you get to a scene like this where the sky's bright, your subject might be a little bit darker, your foreground is even darker than that. And trying to determine the best way to properly expose your entire scene from the foreground to the midground to the background, that's the real challenge, and also the topic of this week's video is to discuss how to bracket your images for those perfectly exposed landscape shots. Now, I know bracketing can be somewhat of an intimidating topic if you've never done it before, but the concept is super simple to do, and the process of actually doing it is probably even easier than that. And I'm hoping by the end of this video, you'll feel super comfortable testing it out on your own. But the overall concept of bracketing is very simple. You just take multiple different images at different exposure levels. I always shoot usually three brackets. My first bracket will be for a properly exposed image. The next bracket will be or the next image will be an underexposed version. And then the third image will be an overexposed version. And then you basically blend everything together in post-processing, thus creating that perfectly exposed landscape image. Now, perhaps one of the coolest things about bracketing is that any camera out there can do it. It doesn't have to be the latest and greatest camera model. It doesn't have to be a camera body that's $2,000 or $3,000 and higher. Literally every camera can do it one way or the other. Now, many cameras today have an auto exposure bracketing feature, AEB, which will automatically do this for you. If it doesn't have that, you can definitely do it manually. But if your camera has an auto exposure bracketing setting, you can actually tell the camera how many images you want to take in your bracket. So you can have a 3-shot bracket, maybe a 5 or a 9-shot bracket, and then you determine how many stops of light are in between each one of those brackets. I always shoot a 3-stop bracket with the properly exposed image, and then one image that's usually 2 stops underexposed and another image that's 2 stops overexposed. But you can really set it up however you like. So just to show you what I'm talking about, if I were to try and capture this image with a single photo, I would probably just dial in settings right around there, 1/20th of a second, f8, ISO 50. And if I wanted to adjust the auto exposure bracket, I would come over here to the drive mode. And this is the area where it has things like single shooting, continuous shooting, your self timers there. And if I come over here, this is the auto exposure bracket setting. I always like to do it on continuous brackets so it'll take the images really quickly. And you'll see right here that I have it set for 3 images, 2 stops of light in between. If I just toggle to the right, you'll see that it's now set at 5 images, 2 stops of light in between, 3 images, 3 stops of light in between. And you can just toggle through this until you get the setting that you would like. And I always do 2 stops of light, 3 images, over 3 images. And then I'm going to focus on the subject, hit the shutter, 2-second timer, and it'll take the 3 images. Perfect. And now I can review the 3 images right here. And this one, of course, is the overexposed version. This is 2 stops overexposed, my proper exposure. And you can see that the sky's completely blown out. It looks, everything in the foreground is properly exposed. The tree is properly exposed. This is the image that I deemed proper exposure, and then this is the one that's underexposed, and you can see actually a little bit of detail in the sky, a little of the colors coming through, but the foreground and the tree is completely silhouetted. Now, if your camera doesn't have auto exposure bracketing, it's no problem at all. This is very simple to do manually, and a lot of times I'll do this manually anyway. But you want to use shutter speed as a way to impact your exposure levels. You don't want to adjust your aperture, your ISO. You want to use your shutter speed. So what you would do is you would take your properly exposed image, and then you would increase your shutter speed 2 stops, and that's going to be for your overexposed image. And since you went 2 stops above your proper exposure, you now need to go 4 stops below to get to 2 stops below your proper exposure. And you would do all of that by using your shutter speed. And I'll show you real quick what I mean. So if I were to do this manually, what I would do is I would come over here and dial in what I would believe to be proper exposure for a single image, which would probably be maybe somewhere right around here. And then I take that photo, and definitely looking at the histogram is a great way to do this. Take that image, and then I would adjust my shutter speed, and I'm going to reduce it now because this is going to be the version for the sky. And once the sky looks good to where you can see a little bit of detail and a little bit of color, you can take that image. And then I'm going to adjust for my third image. This is going to be the overexposed version. And I'm just basically lengthening my shutter speed here now. And I just want to make sure that the tree is more properly exposed in the foreground because I want to be able to capture a lot of that color. The sky being blown out is really irrelevant right here. This is just for the foreground. and take that image right there. Now you might be asking yourself, Mark, why don't you just use a graduated neutral density filter to kind of bring down the harshness of the sky, thus allowing you to still properly expose your foreground? And yes, that's absolutely a very popular route to go, and it's something that I used to do as well. I don't do it too much anymore. I usually just stick with exposure bracketing, mainly because I think using graduated neutral density filters is kind of a destructive workflow because its effects cannot be removed or altered in any way in post-processing. So if your filter isn't in straight, or if you bring it down too low and it's darkening down the tops of a tree or darkening down the top of a mountain, and it just kind of creates a very unnatural look. And when you get that back in post-processing, you really can't alter it all. So I usually stick with auto exposure bracketing or manual exposure bracketing. And I've just found that the dynamic range in cameras is so good and post-processing software is so good nowadays that you can just use those graduated filters in post and get a very similar effect. Now, a couple quick tips. You want to make sure you're using a tripod, a remote shutter release, or a self-timer on your camera. You just want to make sure that there's no camera shake in between exposures. You want to make sure that every one of your images for your bracketer is exactly the same. It's just going to make your life so much easier when you go to post-process these images. It's going to make them all blend together and stitch together better, and just going to make the overall editing process much more seamless. So I'm going to pack things up here, head back to my house, and I'll show you exactly how I blend these together and edit the final image. Now, something I forgot to mention earlier has to do with knowing when you should use exposure bracketing. When I first started doing this and I became comfortable with the concept and I really understood exactly why I was doing this, I just started shooting everything with brackets, and it was a little bit of an overkill. You really don't need to do that. A lot of times your camera can capture the scene in a single image, but understanding when to bracket and when not to bracket is something that puzzled me. And there's something called the one-stop rule that really helped me out. And what that is when you get to your scene and you get all set up, and if you put your camera in manual mode, pick your aperture, pick your ISO level, and start adjusting your shutter speed until the light meter at the bottom of your camera, at the bottom of your LCD, indicates 0 or a proper exposure. And then if you notice your foreground is dark and the sky is very bright, which is more than likely the case, if you start to increase your shutter speed to allow more light into your camera to more brightly expose the foreground, and once you get your foreground looking good, if you look at that light meter and it's indicating a value more than +1, which means you added more than a full stop of exposure, that might be a sign that you should bracket that shot. And the same thing with the sky. If the sky's too bright, you start to dial in a faster shutter speed, letting less light into the camera. And if you look at your light meter once the sky looks good, and you notice that that has a value of more than -1, so more than -1 stop of exposure for the sky or for your overall scene, that's the same sign. You should probably bracket that shot. But if your adjustments are less than a full stop, if you're 3/4 of a stop underexposed or a half a stop overexposed, that's fine. You can definitely capture that in a single image. The dynamic range of your camera will more than likely suffice for that. So once you get your photos home and you get them loaded in your computer, there's multiple different ways to blend these together. You can use Capture One. I'm going to do them in Lightroom for this video. You can also use Photoshop, where you can manually paint in the different exposures, or use a luminosity mask. But I find Lightroom does a really good job, and it's definitely the easiest as well. So this is an exposure series that I took while in Yosemite. This is the image that is 2 stops underexposed. This is the image that is deemed the proper exposure. And then this is the image that is 2 stops overexposed. So as you can see, this scene is a perfect candidate with a very bright sky and a rather dark foreground area. So to merge them together, I'm just going to hold down the Shift key, select all 3 images, right click, and I'm going to come down here to Photo Merge, and I'm going to select HDR. Now when HDR pulls up, it's going to go ahead and show a preview right here. I always leave auto align selected just in case your tripod was bumped or something and the images might not match up perfectly. And then auto settings basically is just telling Lightroom to put a real quick edit on the basic panel just to kind of help you get started with your edit. And I always leave that as well. And then the de-ghost amount, I always leave at none. That just has to do if you have something moving in your scene and there might be a little bit of ghosting that you need to resolve, but I usually just leave it at none and then hit merge. Now, this usually takes a couple seconds, and I know HDR kind of has a bad rap these days, but I think HDR software has definitely come a long way, and I think there's a way to shoot exposure bracketed series that will create a very natural looking HDR image. So if you shoot a series of, say, I don't know, 5 or 6 images, and every single one of those images is 2 stops apart,
and for a total of 10 or 12 stops of dynamic range, your entire scene, I think those are the types of situations where you kind of get that HDR-ish look. But in this situation where I only have 3 images, 2 stops apart for a total dynamic range of 6 stops, I think that's a good scenario to really create a very high dynamic but natural looking image. So here is the final image right here. And as you'll be able to see, Lightroom put a real quick edit on it, but I want you to notice something here. So if we come back to, this is the image that we deemed was proper exposure. So let's say this is all that I had to work with. And I wanted to bring up the shadows. So let's bring them up quite a bit so I can see them. I'm going to compare this to the HDR version right here. And I want you to see something. I found this very interesting. Look at the greens in the trees. See how much more saturated and richer the greens look in the trees? And the same thing with the granite of the mountains too. So if we pull up El Capitan here, see how much just richer and deeper and more vibrant the colors are? That's one of the reasons, one of the big benefits of using an HDR type of an image and using the exposure brackets to create that photograph, because the images that were captured with a little bit brighter exposure, those are usually going to render deeper and more vibrant colors. Now, what else is really cool is if we come back here and look at this is the properly exposed image again. Reduce the shadows back, and let's bring the highlights all the way down. So this is as good as I could get, just bringing the highlights to -100 on the sky. And let's compare this to the HDR version. Hit that and compare. See the difference in the sky? That, like, look at this entire area here. There's so much more detail in the actual HDR version compared to the single shot version. And then of course, if you look up here at the sky, see how much more blue that area is. So the sky drastically looks better in this area right through here as well, where the sun is kind of peeking through, hitting Half Dome there. So those are just kind of some, I thought that was pretty interesting, looking at a single version versus the blended version as to what those types of differences are. So once you have the photo merged together, now you can go in and edit just that final version. So I'm going to come up here, go back to our HDR version. I think Lightroom made it a little bit too bright for my taste, so I'm definitely going to bring it down some. You can really see the detail in the sky come out that way, and maybe reduce the shadows just a little bit more. I don't want them too bright, but yeah, I think that looks very good right there. So that's just a real quick edit. You could definitely go through and go through all the panels and add a little, clarity and sharpening, maybe a little bit of vibrance or additional saturation if you like. But that's just kind of a real quick walkthrough of how do you actually blend an HDR image, or how you create an HDR image based off a bracketed series in Lightroom. So I hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you have any questions, as always, please leave those in the comments section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it a thumbs up, it definitely helps. It helps out the channel. And subscribe if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I'll see you next week. Bye.